Welcome to the podcast. I'm Angela Bobier, and this is Life in the Talbot Settlement, brought to you by Tyrconnell Heritage Society and Backus-Page House Museum. In this series, we will do our best to give you a full appreciation of the history of Western Elgin County in southwestern Ontario, from First Nations through the original European settlers to the 1950s. I'll cover one topic per episode, with the first 8 setting the tone for who we are, where we are, and what we do here at Backus-Page House Museum. Please follow us on all social media by searching at Backus-Page House, spelt BACKUSPAGEHOUSE. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. You might have noticed in the last year or so some bright white and blue signs seemingly in the middle of nowhere. Largey, Coins Corners, Tyrconnell, Campbellton, and Cowell are the names listed. What are these about, you might ask? Well, these are vanished villages, once booming with life, now hardly even ghosts. And these 5 are just the start of the project organized by the Municipality of Dunwich Heritage Committee. Today, I will introduce you to a few of these communities in Dunwich Township and some of the vibrant lives lived in each. Now let's begin. Our first town, Burwell's Corners, started with the family of the same name. Malin Burwell, first-generation Canadian, became a surveyor in 1809 and was Registrar of Middlesex by 1811. He lived with his wife, Sarah Hahn, sons Hercules, Isaac Brock, Leonidas, John Walpole, Hannibal, Edward, Alexander, and daughters Louise and Mary. Alexander died as a child when he fell into a boiling cauldron, leaving Malin scarred emotionally and physically from the attempt to save his son. In later years, Leonidas became rebellious, and disputes caused the family to fall apart. Even still, Colonel Burwell led the construction of the town's registry office. He did innumerable surveys, supported the Anglican Church, managed the post office, started a brickyard, and preserved the Southwold earthworks. The town also had a distillery, general store, gristmill, 2 sawmills, one of which was horse-powered, and the post office run from Burwell's house. Although a peaceful place, there is one shocking case of murder. George Ashby was an immigrant of English descent, a heavy drinker with a hot temper. On May 24, 1838, after the Volunteer Militia's annual reunion, it is believed that this mix of things led to him being attacked while walking home through the woods. They say it was a duel, as the severance of his head must have been done with a saber. A bottle of spirits and a stick were tied in Ashby's handkerchief and shoved down the open neck. The murderer was never found, and probably never looked for. From Burwell's Corners, let's go to North Dunwich, to small Campbellton. It was not an official town until there was a post office, but records of its establishment were inconsistent, so it's hard to tell exactly when Campbellton existed. We estimate it was between 1873 and 1877. It was named for the first settler, Robert Campbell, who donated land for the church, school, and a store. All that's left is the brick schoolhouse and the district burial grounds to the north. The next community is best known as Cowell, but was known in 1863 as New Montreal. The origin is unknown, but a French name on a Scottish settlement was never going to last. They renamed Cowell after Comgal, Scotland, where Robert Burns' sweetheart, Mary Campbell, was born. The area was heavily wooded, which meant lots of timber, but difficult farmland. The swamp didn't help those matters at all. Yet the settlers were stubborn, or persevered, and soon the area had 2 general stores, a post office, a shoemaker, 2 sawmills, a blacksmith, and in 1859 a brick and tile business. 2 schools served the area, each built, moved, and destroyed repeatedly. The church was built back in 1853. Land obtained by Hugh Fletcher and the 42 by 30-foot edifice were dedicated in 1856 by Reverend Scott of St. Andrew's Church in London, Ontario. They made the church with no clear roads, so getting there on Sunday morning was difficult. They finally got a minister in 1865, a Reverend John Stewart of Blythe. He did services in English and in Gaelic. Cowell dissipated in the mid-1890s when the Dead Falls Hotel and grocery store burned down, and they had depleted their lumber supply too much to rebuild. All that remains now are some dwellings and the memories of the community hall, Chalmers United Church, and the memories at the unkept baseball diamond. Then let's move on to Iona, which started as one of Colonel Burwell's land surveys in 1809. The layout designated by the government didn't account for the swamp, so he made new land designations with Colonel Talbot's approval. William Brooke was the first recorded settler, an American. He built a general store, did well, decided to push his luck with a sawmill, went bankrupt, and after 22 years of residence had to flee the country and his debts. The other American was named Canute, a War of Independence veteran that boasted about his exploits too much for anyone's liking. In the War of 1812, he refused the oath of allegiance until Talbot threatened to take his land. It is said that his wife, quote, hastened his death. That's from Sims History, Volume 1. Canute was buried unmarked in his backyard, and she remarried to a man named Johnson. The name came from the Southold Township side, Iona, after the Scottish Holy Isle. The Dunwich side wished it to be called Elliotsville, after Mrs. Sarah Elliott. Her husband, George Elliott, was a businessman until his death, leaving her a wealthy widow, and she donated much of her land to the Methodist Church. Sadly for Sarah, the post office called the shots, and they picked the name Iona. The first postmaster was William Harris, also the clerk of the 4th Division Court. His son Albert died in 1860, and his wife Phoebe Ann died 3 years later. After her death, he sank into despair. Some called him demented. He started going on long walks at night, and only 6 days after Phoebe Ann's death, he just didn't come back. When the search party found him, he was leaning by a brook. They say he died of overexposure and a broken heart. Eerily, the spot he went to rest was to be the site of W.H. Hendershot's murder almost 30 years later. After Harris, the post office went like a hot potato, hand to hand, owner to owner. Most businesses did. Mills struggled with water shortages and fires. William Taylor and Grosset McKay started a mercantile business that was carried on by Taylor's widow until debt forced her to sell. There was also, during the American Civil War, Daniel DeCow selling raw materials to the fighters. It did make him very wealthy, for a time. But as the American Civil War went on, he wound up with more product and credit notes than gain. He sold everything in little amounts until his death at 58 years old. Some businesses did very well. Iona was known for its horse-powered travel industry. Peddlers were also favored, especially by the women to whom they sold sewing supplies. At the back lot of what is now the school, one such peddler is buried. He was found frozen the day after a great snowstorm and buried where he lay, for fear the body held disease. In 1866, the Fenian raids made the people feel unprotected, and they decided to do something about it. A militia was formed, a drill hall built, and a name. Well, they never settled on the name. Once the raids died down, the drill hall was donated to the fairgrounds. Barnum's Circus performed there on a few occasions. Other famous folks from the area were internationally acclaimed astronomer James Craig Watson, James Philpott, who assisted with the Underground Railroad, the illiterate Elder McDermott, and fiction author Luke Sharp and Robert Barr. Now, we can't talk about Iona without mentioning Iona Station. If you listened to our previous episode, the railroad era of Dunwich and Aldborough, you would know that the town's origin story can be completely summed up with trains. Now, Iona Station is also the birthplace of John Kenneth Galbraith, the famous economist and writer. His brother Duncan Galbraith opened the general store and ran the post office. Nicol McCall is another famous local. Born in Scotland, Raised in Iona Station, he joined the Army during the 1837 rebellion, then climbed the ranks of the Army, then onto the legal system. He became part of the first Legislative Assembly of Ontario and the Canadian Southern Railroad scheme. He died at 66 years old. The town began to die out in 1888 after the grist mill burned down on May 31st. Now our next hamlet is known as Largey, but before that it was called Duff's Corners. The original name came from Sir Alexander Duff, church leader and missionary. The Largey Church was built in 1855 with a cemetery next door. There was also a general store from 1855 to 1884, a blacksmith, post office, cheese factory, and the infamous tavern, the Auger Hole. It would be a travesty to talk about Largey and not tell the tale of its beloved Auger Hole. Built as a hotel in 1850, it became a tavern as time went on. It was on Lot 11, Concession 1. The reason is disputed, but somehow the Auger Hole got on the wrong side of the tax collectors, deep in debt, and the tavern was going to be taken. A group of dedicated locals decided that that was just unacceptable, and with logs, rope, and lots of manpower, they rolled the tavern across the street in one night to Lot 11, Concession 2. Because the legal documents addressed Concession 1, they were rendered void, and the Auger Hole was saved. It continued to operate until 1880, when many of the regulars moved away. The building was moved again and refurbished as a pig pen. To wrap all of this up, we return to the home of our Backus-Page House Museum. You've heard us call the area Tyrconnell and Little Ireland, but back in the humble beginnings, it was merely Lot Number 9. Being directly on Lake Erie, it was a popular shipping port and fishery. The first residents were the infamous Colonel Talbot and his assistant, George Crane. They came to Tyrconnell in 1803. Once here, Crane married Isabel Findlay, had a son named Anthony, and died in 1834. His son took over the farm and cared for Isabel until she died in 1854. Anthony married Mary McVickers, had a daughter named Mary, and two sons, A. Herbert and W. Albert. They died in 1903 at the ages of 40 and 44, and their mother Mary only lived to be 42. The next group of immigrants is the most well-known, including the Backuses, Pierces, Pattersons, and Storys. They are the reason we call this area Little Ireland, because they're of Irish descent. To learn more about them, please go back to episode 5 of our podcast called Irish Founding Families. During the War of 1812, American renegades disguised themselves as indigenous peoples to raid all the lakefront villages. Brigadier General MacArthur and his troops destroyed the Port Talbot mill, leaving the locals with a long journey or gruesome labor to grind wheat into necessary flour. When a new gristmill, sawmill, and warehouse were built in 1817, the people rejoiced. Business climbed for a while after that, leading to a general store, ashery, tannery, public library, carding mills, and 2 distilleries. One was owned by Archibald McIntyre, the other by a Mr. Steele. The first post office was built in the house of Colonel Leslie Patterson and ran from 1837 to 1852. There were 2 hotels, Tyrconnell House, run by William S. Froome, and the Globe Hotel of Elias Hawkins. Early churches were Anglican and Methodist. Now, during Prohibition, rum runners used Port Talbot's lack of security to smuggle alcohol to the United States. In the middle of the night, a truck could drive up without headlights to drop off a well-wrapped load and then sneak away. Once it was gone, a boat would slip up and retrieve it. Eventually, they tried this closer to Port Burwell, but they were caught. Just as dangerous, and yet less talked about, are the waves around Plum Point. From children's drownings to trapped or wrecked cargo ships, that area has taken many lives. Colonel Talbot's brother was first to call the area Tyrconnell, but the name wasn't adopted until James Blackwood began surveying the land in 1852. Blackwood and his brother ran several successful businesses in Tyrconnell until fires led to debts, and they had to sell everything. It was bought back by the original distributor, George Macbeth, and then later bought by Meredith Conn. Other businesses were also bought, sold, and do-si-doed as railroads developed and people stopped shipping things through water. After a while, the pier was rendered unnecessary and left to the abuse of the Lake Erie waves. While each of these communities faded for different reasons, it all sums up to progress. Railroads and highways make long-distance transportation easier, and people didn't need these little rest towns anymore. The work moved on, and natural resources were depleted. There was no reason for them to stay. We at Backus-Page House Museum and Tyrconnell Heritage Society, we stay for these stories, and we hope that you will too. By no means are these the only vanished villages in Dunwich Township, so probably in future episodes we'll cover others like Coins Corners and more. Please join us next week for a special episode about World War II veteran George Henry Backus, also known to his foster family as Gordon Gilbert. Please share the podcast with your friends and follow us on all social media platforms at Backus-Page House. The Backus-Page House Museum and Tyrconnell Heritage Society acknowledges the land we are on today as the traditional territory of First Nations people, the Attawandaron, and the Iroquois. As settlers at a settler-focused museum, we value both the significant historical and contemporary contributions of all Original peoples and ask how we can be supportive in Indigenous cultural renewal. Life in the Talbot Settlement is a production of Tyrconnell Heritage Society, operators of Backus-Page House Museum, funded by the Department of Canadian Heritage. Your host has been Angela Bobier. Music provided by Jack Witmer. Thanks to our producer, Katlyn Reintsma. To make a charitable donation and to contact the Backus-Page House Museum, visit our website, www.backuspagehouse.ca. And thank you for listening.